You broke the wrong girl's crutches tonight, son. And by sunrise, this whole town is going to know your name and mine. She hit the pavement before she even understood she was falling. 1 second, Emily Carter was standing on her own 2 feet, her feet hard-earned, fought for, bled for, and the next she was down on the freezing wet concrete with both halves of her custom crutches lying in the gutter like snapped bones. Rain in her eyes, laughter above her, a crowd of strangers who once looked away and kept walking. 22 years old, and the whole world had just decided she wasn't worth stopping for. And then through the storm, low and steady and getting closer, the sound of a single motorcycle. If this story moves you the way it moved me, do me one small favor before we go on. Hit that subscribe button and stay with me all the way to the end, because the ending is going to hit you right in the chest. And do me one more thing, drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments right now so I can see just how far this story travels tonight. All right, let's begin. Emily Carter didn't cry when she fell. That came later. In the first moment, there was nothing in her at all except a white ringing silence, the kind that arrives when your body understands what's happening a full second before your mind can catch up. She was on the ground. The rain was coming down cold and sideways across the university plaza, and her hands were flat against the pavement, and somewhere off to her left in the wet gutter, where the runoff was rushing toward the drain, lay the two clean broken pieces of the only thing that let her walk through the world like a person. "Whoops," a voice said above her. "Guess those things weren't built too strong, huh?" Brett Callahan. She didn't have to look up to know it was him. She knew the voice the way you know the sound of a dog that's bitten you before. Smooth, easy, amused, the voice of a young man who had never once in his 21 years been made to answer for a single thing he'd done. "Brett," her own voice came out steadier than she felt. That surprised her. "Give me the pieces." "The what?" "The pieces of my crutches. Just hand them to me." He crouched down beside her. She could smell him now. Expensive cologne, wet leather jacket, the faint sourness of beer under it. He picked up one of the broken halves and turned it over in his hands, like he was inspecting a stick he'd found in the yard. "You know these are like ugly, right?" he said. "You could get the normal kind. The metal ones from the drugstore. Why you gotta have the special ones?" "Because I designed them," she said. "Because my hands are damaged and the normal ones tear the skin off my palms after 20 minutes. Give them to me." "Designed them." He laughed softly like she'd said something adorable. "You designed your little sticks. That's cute." And then, still smiling, still looking right into her eyes so she'd understand, it wasn't an accident, that it had never once been an accident. He tossed the broken half over his shoulder back into the rushing gutter and watched it float toward the drain. Something inside Emily's chest cracked as clean as the crutch had. "You," she stopped. Because if she said the next word, she was going to sob, and she would rather have died right there on the concrete than let Brett Callahan see her sob. She pressed her lips together so hard they went white, and she breathed through her nose, and she did not cry. There were people all around them. That was the part she would think about later at 3 a.m, staring at her ceiling. That was the part that stayed. There were at least 15 people within 30 feet of her, students with backpacks and umbrellas, a professor she recognized from the engineering building, 2 campus groundskeepers, a woman in scrubs cutting across the plaza toward the med center. 15 people. And every single one of them looked at a girl on the ground in the rain, being taunted by a 200-pound athlete, and decided it was somebody else's problem. "Somebody help me up," Emily said. She hated how it came out. "Small, please." A guy near the fountain met her eyes for a second. He was maybe 19. He had a nice face. She saw him think about it. She actually watched the thought move across his features, "Should I?" And then she watched him look at Brett and look at Brett's build and look at the 3 other athletes standing behind Brett with their arms crossed and their grins on, and she watched the boy decide his own comfort was worth more than her dignity. He looked away and kept walking. "See, nobody's gonna help you," Brett said, almost gently, crouched there beside her, like they were old friends having a chat. "You want to know why? Because everybody here knows who my dad is. My dad's name is on the building, Emily. It's on the science building where you take your little classes. You think anybody at this school is going to cross the Callahans over some crippled chick's plastic sticks?" She turned her head and looked at him then, fully, for the first time. "Say that word again," she said quietly. "What word?" "You know what word." Brett's smile widened. He leaned in close enough that she felt his breath, and he said it slow, one syllable at a time, so she'd feel each one land. Crip, pled, chick. And that was when Emily Carter stopped being afraid. It's a strange thing, fear leaving a body. She'd read about it in the accounts of soldiers her father used to keep on the shelf, how sometimes a person got pushed so far past the edge of what they could take that the fear just stopped mattering, ran out, went silent, and what was left underneath it was something colder and harder and far more dangerous. My father, Emily said, and her voice didn't shake at all now, spent 22 years in the United States Army. He came home from his third deployment in a wheelchair, and he never once in his whole life let anybody make him feel like less of a man for it. So you can throw my crutches in the drain, Brett. You can call me whatever your empty little brain can come up with, but you are not going to make me feel small. You don't have the size for it. For just a flicker, half a second, no more, something moved behind Brett's eyes. Not shame. He wasn't capable of shame, but something. A recalibration. He hadn't expected the girl on the ground to have teeth. Then his jaw tightened and the flicker was gone, and he stood up, all 6'3" of him, and looked down at her the way you'd look at a bug you were deciding whether to bother stepping on. Your dad sounds like a real hero, he said. Where's he now? Emily said nothing. Yeah, Brett said, that's what I thought. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his wallet, peeled off $100 bill, and let it flutter down onto the wet ground in front of her. It landed in a puddle and started to soak through. There, buy yourself some new sticks. Consider it charity. I'm a generous guy. His friends laughed. One of them said something about being late for practice, and they turned to go, 4 of them, big and dry under a shared umbrella, leaving Emily Carter sitting in a puddle in the freezing rain with $100 bill dissolving in front of her, and no way, no physical way at all to stand up and walk away with any of her dignity intact. She looked at the money. For one terrible second, she thought about taking it, not because she wanted it, because she was cold and she was soaked through, and she had $11 in her bank account until Friday, and a new set of proper crutches cost $400 she didn't have. She looked at the money for one terrible second, and then she picked it up and she called out, Brett, and when he turned around, she threw it back at him, a wet, crumpled ball that bounced off his chest and fell in the puddle again. Keep it, she said. You're going to need it more than me. He stared at her, and for a moment she thought she'd made a real mistake because his face went dark in a way she hadn't seen before, and he took a step back toward her. And that was when everybody in the plaza heard it. Low, under the rain, a rumble that you felt in your teeth before you heard it in your ears. It came from the far end of the quad past the library, and it grew, and it did not stop growing, and heads turned all across the plaza one after another, the way heads turn when something is coming that the body recognizes as important before the mind does. A motorcycle rolled into the plaza and stopped. It was a big machine, old and clean and cared for chrome, dark with rain. And the man on it was big too, not young. That was the first thing you notice. Not one of these college kids, a man well into his 60s with a gray beard and gray hair pulled back and a face like weathered stone. He wore a black leather vest over a heavy jacket, and across the back of that vest, anyone close enough could read the words stitched in red and white. He cut the engine. The rumble died, and in the sudden quiet, the only sound was the rain. The man swung his leg off the bike slow, unhurried the way a man moves when he has never once in his life needed to rush for anybody. He set his boots on the wet concrete, and he looked not at the crowd, not at the 4 athletes, straight at Emily Carter sitting in her puddle. Ma'am, he said, his voice was low and rough like gravel in a bucket. You look like you could use a hand. Nobody moved. Brett had stopped mid-step. His 3 friends had gone very still under their umbrella. The professor by the fountain had stopped pretending not to watch. The man walked over. He didn't hurry. He crossed the plaza with a slight hitch in his own step, an old injury, an old man's knees, and he came to a stop in front of Emily, and without a word, without any fuss at all, he crouched down to her level. Up close, his eyes were pale gray and startlingly gentle, and they did something no one else's eyes had done. In the last 10 minutes, they looked at her like she was a person. Name's Jack, he said. Some folks call me Ghost. You gonna let me help you up, or you gonna make an old man do it the hard way? Emily opened her mouth. Nothing came out. After 10 minutes of being spat on by the world, kindness was the one thing she had no defense against, and she felt the whole hard wall she'd been holding up start to shake. My crutches, she managed. They broke them. They're in the... I saw, Jack said quietly. I saw the whole thing. From back by the road. He glanced just once over his shoulder at Brett, a short, flat look there and gone. We'll talk about that. First things first. He slid one big arm under hers, careful testing, watching her face to see where it hurt. You tell me if I grab wrong. My brother had a bad hip. I know how to do this without hurting you. On 3, 1, 2. And he lifted her. Easy, like she weighed nothing. She got one foot under herself, and he took her weight against his side and held her steady. And for the first time in 10 minutes, Emily Carter was upright, and the relief of it just being off that cold ground, just being up, nearly took her legs out from under her all over again. There, Jack said. There we go. I got you. Lean on me, I'm not gonna break. Hey, Brett said. Jack didn't turn around. Hey, old man, I'm talking to you. Slowly, so slowly, it was almost insulting. Jack settled Emily's weight more securely against his side, made sure she was steady, and only then turned his head to look at Brett Callahan. Son, Jack said, I heard you the first time. I was just deciding whether you were worth answering. A couple of the students at the edge of the crowd made a sound, a sharp little intake of breath. An almost laugh quickly swallowed. Brett's face flushed. You know who I am? No, Jack said. And I gotta tell you, from what I've seen of you in the last 2 minutes, I'm real glad about that. My father is... I don't care who your father is. Jack said it without heat. That was the thing that made it land. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't puffing up. He said it the way you'd tell a child the stove was hot, flat, certain, faintly bored. I've met 100 men who led with their daddy's name. You know what they all had in common? Not one of them had done a single thing in his own life worth leading with instead. The flush on Brett's face deepened to a blotchy red. You need to mind your business, all right? This has got nothing to do with you. See now, that's where you're wrong. Jack shifted, easing Emily's weight, and there was something in the movement, some economy, some old readiness that made both of Brett's friends take a half step back without meaning to. A young woman gets knocked down in the rain in front of 15 people, and not one of them lifts a finger. That's everybody's business. That's the whole ball game, son. That's the only thing that's ever mattered. He reached into his jacket. Brett flinched. Jack noticed the flinch, filed it away. What he pulled out was not a weapon. It was a folded blue bandana worn soft with age, and he held it out to Emily. You're soaked through, he said gently. Won't fix it, but wipe your face, sweetheart. You've got rain in your eyes. Emily took it. Her hands were shaking. She wiped her eyes, and under the cover of the rain, nobody could tell that not all of the water on her face was coming from the sky. Brett tried once more. He didn't know how to lose, so he didn't know how to leave. You're gonna regret this, he said. You put your hands on me, I'll have you. I never touched you, Jack said mildly. Ask any one of these 15 witnesses. I helped a young lady off the ground. That's all I did. He tilted his head. You, on the other hand, you snapped a disabled woman's medical equipment and threw it in a storm drain in front of a crowd, then called her names I won't repeat in front of her. Now. He let that sit for a second. You want to keep talking about who's going to regret what? Silence. Brett looked around the plaza at the crowd that had stopped at the phones, that had come out at the professor by the fountain, at the raw, wet reality of what he'd done, now laid out plainly by a stranger who wasn't afraid of him. For the first time, something crossed his face that Emily had never once seen there. Uncertainty. Whatever, Brett muttered. She's not even worth it. He jerked his head at his friends. Let's go. That's a good idea, Jack agreed. Brett got maybe 10 feet before Jack spoke again, not loud, but the kind of voice that carries. Callahan. Brett stopped. He hadn't given his name. He turned around slow. Jack was looking at him with those pale gray eyes, and he wasn't smiling, and he wasn't angry, and somehow that was worse than both. I heard your name, Jack said. When your buddy said you were late for practice, Brett Callahan. He nodded like he was setting it down somewhere careful. I'm going to remember it. Not for tonight. Tonight's over, you go on home. But I want you to sleep on something, son. There's men in this world you can shove around, and there's men you can't, and the whole trick of a life is learning to tell the difference before you find out the hard way. He paused. You just found out. You just don't know it yet. Brett stared at him a second longer. Then, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't make it worse, he turned and walked away into the rain, his three friends trailing after him, and the crowd began slowly to break apart and move on the way. Crowds do the moment the danger's passed, and everyone's suddenly very busy again. And then it was just the two of them, an old biker and a shaking girl alone in the middle of an emptying plaza in the pouring rain. "Okay," Jack said, and all the hardness went out of his voice at once, and what was left was something almost unbearably kind. "Okay, he's gone. You did good holding your ground like that. Most folks fold. You didn't." He looked down at her. "Now let's get you somewhere warm before you catch your death. You got a place close." Emily nodded, not trusting her voice. "You got somebody there, roommate, family, somebody who can look after you tonight?" She shook her head. Jack was quiet for a moment. "Nobody," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm fine," Emily said. "It came out thin. I do this alone. I've been doing it alone. I'm fine." And Jack Sullivan looked at this girl, 22 years old, soaked to the bone, holding herself up against a stranger, because there was no one else in the world to lean on, insisting through chattering teeth that she was fine, and something moved across his weathered face that she couldn't read yet, but that she would come to understand in the days ahead was recognition. He was looking at somebody who reminded him of somebody he'd loved, somebody he'd lost. "Yeah," he said softly. "I know that word too. Fine, my little brother used to say it about 100 times a day." He didn't explain. Not then. He just gathered her a little more securely against his side and said, "Come on, there's a diner 2 blocks up, stays open all night. I'll buy you a cup of coffee and something hot to eat, and you can be fine where it's warm. That a deal? You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He was already walking her toward the sidewalk, slow, matching his hitching stride to her broken one. That's kind of the whole point, isn't it? Nobody in this plaza had to do anything tonight. That's exactly how you ended up on the ground. They walked in silence for half a block, the rain easing to a fine cold mist. And it was Emily finally who broke it, because there was a question sitting in her chest so heavy she couldn't carry it another step. "Why did you stop?" she asked. "Everybody else there were so many people and they all just, why did you stop?" Jack didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had gone somewhere far off. "You want to know the truth," he said. "I almost didn't. I was riding through heading home, seen a crowd, figured it wasn't my business." He shook his head slowly. "Then I saw those crutches go in the drain, and I saw 15 people watch it happen and do nothing. And I thought about," he stopped. His jaw worked. "I thought about somebody who needed people to show up for him a long time ago, and they didn't. Nobody showed up. And I have spent 30 years wishing I could go back and be the man who showed up." He looked down at her. "Can't go back, but I can show up tonight, so I did." Emily didn't know what to say to that, so she said the only true thing she had. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Jack said. And there was something new in his voice, now quiet but with a weight underneath it, like the first low rumble of a storm still miles off. "Sit down, get warm, tell me what really happened tonight. Because a man doesn't snap a stranger's crutches on the first try. That kind of cruelty's got practice behind it. That's not the first time that boy's put his hands on you, is it?" Emily stopped walking. Just for a second, just long enough. And in that 1 second, that tiny involuntary hitch, Jack Sullivan had his answer, and his pale gray eyes went very, very still. "No," he said quietly, answering his own question. "It's not the first time. How long?" "It's not, it's complicated." "How long, Emily?" She looked up at him. This stranger, this old man with the rough voice and the gentle eyes who'd appeared out of a storm and lifted her off the ground when 15 people wouldn't. And maybe it was the cold or the shock or the simple staggering relief of being asked of somebody finally asking, but the wall she'd been holding up for 6 months came down all at once. "Since October," she whispered. "It's been since October." And Jack Sullivan closed his eyes for a moment, the way a man does when he's just been handed something heavy that he's going to carry now whether he wants to or not. "Okay," he said, opening them. "Okay, sweetheart, you're going to tell me all of it. Everything, every day since October. And I want you to understand something before you start." He held her gaze and there was no anger in it, only a terrible quiet steadiness. I'm not going to do anything crazy. I'm not that kind of man, not anymore. But when you're done telling me you and me are going to sit down and figure out how this ends, because it's going to end. That part I can promise you right now, standing here in the rain. Whatever's been happening to you since October, it ends this week. They came up on the diner, warm yellow light spilling out onto the wet sidewalk, the neon sign buzzing, the smell of coffee and grease drifting out the prop door. Jack held it open for her and helped her through and eased her down into a booth in the back, and a tired waitress brought 2 mugs without being asked. And for the first time in 6 months, and far longer than 6 months, if Emily was honest, in longer than she could remember, she was sitting across from somebody who wanted to hear the whole thing. She wrapped both hands around the hot mug. Her fingers were still shaking. She stared down into the coffee. "My dad died 14 months ago," she said. "That's where it starts. You have to know that part first, or none of the rest makes sense." Jack said nothing. He just folded his big scarred hands on the table and waited the way a man waits when he's decided he has all the time in the world for you. He was in a wheelchair the last 9 years of his life. Emily went on, her voice steadying as she found the rhythm of it. "From the war. And the equipment they gave him, the chairs, the ramps, the stuff that was supposed to give him his life back, half of it, was junk, cheap, broke down, hurt him. And I used to sit on the floor of his workshop and watch him try to fix it himself. And I told myself, when I grow up, I'm going to build the stuff they should have built. For him. For all of them." She looked up. "That's why I'm in engineering. That's why I designed my own crutches, the ones Brett threw in the drain. They were a prototype. I've been building an affordable line for veterans, for people like my dad." Something had changed in Jack's face. Something had gone tight around his eyes and slack around his mouth all at once, and his folded hands had gone very still on the table. "Say that again," he said. His voice had dropped, gone almost hoarse. "What you're building. Say it again." "Mobility devices," Emily said, not understanding. "Affordable ones. Crutches chairs, braces for injured veterans, for people who can't pay $4,000 for equipment that should cost $400. It's just a student project right now. I don't have funding. I borrowed was." "For veterans," Jack said. "Yes." "Like your father." "Yes." And Jack Sullivan, this enormous, weathered, unshakable old man who had walked into a hostile crowd without blinking, who had stared down Brett Callahan without raising his voice, who had lifted her off the ground like she weighed nothing at all. Jack Sullivan put one of those big scarred hands flat over his mouth and looked away, out the dark window at the rain, and for a long moment he could not speak. "Mr. Sullivan," Emily said. "Jack, are you okay?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally lowered his hand and turned back to her, his pale gray eyes were wet, and he made no effort at all to hide it. "I had a brother," he said. "Danny, younger than me by 6 years. Got hurt bad when he was 19, accident. Not the war, but it doesn't matter how it happens, does it? The world treats you the same after. Put him in a chair for the rest of his life." He swallowed. "And I watched that same thing you're describing. The junk equipment, the stuff that broke, the stuff that hurt him. I watched my baby brother get treated like he didn't matter for 30 years, and I never had the first idea how to fix it. I'm no engineer. I'm just an old man who's good with a wrench and knows how to ride." His voice cracked. "Danny passed 2 years ago, and I have sat up more nights than I can count, wishing there was some way to make his whole life have meant something. To make it count for the next Danny." He reached across the table slow and put one huge hand over both of Emily's small shaking ones, where they wrapped around her coffee mug. "And then a girl gets knocked down in the rain right in front of me," he said very quietly. "And I stopped for no reason I could have named, and she turns out to be building the exact thing I've been praying for 30 years somebody would build." He shook his head slowly, and something like wonder moved through the grief on his face. "You tell me that's an accident, Emily. You tell me a man rides through a storm on the one night on the one corner and it's just luck. I don't believe that. I stopped believing in luck a long time ago." Emily's eyes filled. She couldn't help it. After a night of being made to feel like nothing, like garbage in a gutter, like a crippled chick whose broken sticks weren't worth a stranger's glance. Somebody was holding her hands across a diner table and telling her that her life's work was an answered prayer. "I don't even know you," she whispered. "No," Jack agreed. "You don't, and I don't know you." He gave her hands a squeeze and sat back, wiping his face roughly with the heel of his palm, gathering himself. But I know your work. I've known your work for 30 years. I just never had a name to put to it till tonight. And I know something else, too. He leaned forward again, and now the grief in his eyes had banked down into something else, something harder and steadier and burning very low and very hot. I know that you have been fighting this fight completely alone for a lot longer than since October. Haven't you? You've been carrying your daddy and Danny and this whole project, and that boy Callahan, all of it on your own two shoulders. And nobody showed up. Not once. Emily didn't answer. She didn't have to. The tears sliding down her face answered for her. Yeah, Jack said softly. That's what I thought. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and the neon of the diner sign flickered against the wet black street. When he spoke again, his voice was low and even and completely certain, and Emily would remember the exact sound of it for the rest of her life. Emily Carter, I need you to listen to me now, and I need you to believe every word because I have never in 66 years said a thing I didn't mean. He looked her dead in the eye. You are done doing this alone. You understand me? Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever that boy or his daddy or that whole school throws at you next, you are not going to face it by yourself, not one more day of your life. Jack, you can't promise. I don't promise things I can't keep. He was already reaching for his phone, an old scratch thing, dialing a number from memory with one thick finger, and there was the faintest ghost of something on his face now that might, in a better light, have been the beginning of a smile. I got some people I need to make a few calls to tonight. Old friends. Brothers. He put the phone to his ear. You just get yourself home and get some sleep, and you show up on that campus tomorrow morning like it's any other day. The line connected. Somebody picked up on the other end. Jack held Emily's eyes as he spoke into the phone, and his voice was soft, and it was the softness of a man who has already decided exactly what he is going to do. Hey, it's Ghost. Yeah, I know what time it is. Wake the others up. A pause. No, nobody's hurt. Not yet. But I need every man who can ride to be on the road before dawn. Another pause, and now the ghost of the smile was real, and it reached all the way up into his tired gray eyes. There's a girl, Jack Sullivan said, who's about to find out she never had to stand alone. Emily didn't sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed in her cold little apartment and stared at the ceiling and turned Jack Sullivan's last words over and over in her mind. There's a girl who's about to find out she never had to stand alone, and she told herself not to believe them. She'd learned that lesson too well. Don't believe the good ones. The good ones leave. Her father had believed the army would take care of him, and the army had handed him a wheelchair with a bad wheel and a stack of forms. She'd believed her mother would stay, and her mother had left when Emily was 14. She'd believed the university disability office would help her when Brett started in October, and the university disability office had told her to fill out an incident report and then lost the incident report. So she lay there and she told herself, he's a nice old man and he meant it when he said it, and by tomorrow he'll have thought better of it, and that's fine, that's okay, that's how it always goes, and I will get up and I will put on my temporary crutches and I will go to campus and I will survive Brett Callahan one more day the way I have survived him every day since October. She almost believed that too. At 4 a.m, she gave up on sleep and made coffee. She couldn't taste and sat at her tiny kitchen table looking at the 2 blueprints pinned to her wall. The crutch design, the wheelchair frame she'd been prototyping in the machine shop when the shop supervisor would let her in after hours. 14 months of work. Her father's face was in a photograph up beside them, a big man in a chair grinning his hand on a young Emily's shoulder, and she looked at him for a long time. I met somebody tonight, Dad, she said out loud to the photograph the way she still did when it was very late and very quiet. He had a brother, like he understood, really understood. She wrapped her hands around the mug. I don't think he's going to come back, but it was nice. For a couple hours, it was really nice to not be the only one. The photograph didn't answer. It never did. But she looked at her father's grin a moment longer, and then she got up because the sky outside was going from black to gray, and it was time to go be brave one more time. The temporary crutches were exactly as bad as she remembered. Drugstore aluminum, the wrong height, the grips already tearing at the raw skin of her palms within the first block. By the time she reached the edge of campus, Her hands were on fire and her shoulders were screaming, and she'd had to stop 3 times to breathe through the pain. She'd woken at 4 and it had still taken her over an hour to make a walk that should have taken 20 minutes. And every painful step of the way, one thought circled Brett's going to be there. He had first period in the same building. He'd be waiting. He'd seen her humiliated, and then he'd seen a stranger take that humiliation away from him. And Emily knew Brett Callahan well enough by now to know exactly what that would do to a boy like that. He'd need to take it back. He'd need to make today worse than yesterday to prove to himself that last night's old man hadn't changed anything. She was right. He was waiting. He was leaning against the wall by the science building doors with 2 of his friends, and the moment he saw her come limping across the quad on her cheap aluminum crutches, his whole face lit up with an ugly kind of joy. "Well, look who it is," he called out loud so everyone crossing the quad could hear. "The engineer. Where's your bodyguard? Sweetheart, that old man drive you to school. He changed your diaper for you too." His friends laughed. A couple of students slowed to watch and then, seeing who it was, hurried on. Emily kept walking. Head down, one painful step, another. Just get to the door. Just get past him and get to the door. She had gotten very, very good at this, at making herself small, at absorbing it, at getting past. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Brett pushed off the wall and stepped into her path. "Those look like drugstore crutches. Aw, couldn't afford the special ones anymore. Somebody break them." He grinned. "Must have been some real jerk." "Get out of my way, Brett." "Or what?" He leaned down into her face and the friendliness dropped clean off his features, and what was underneath was the thing Emily had learned to be genuinely afraid of. "Your old man's not here now. It's just you and me, same as it's been since October. And you know what happens now, don't you? Same thing that happens every day." He reached out and flicked the crutch under her right arm, just a flick, just enough to make her stumble, just enough that if she went down, it'd look like she'd tripped. Whoops, she caught herself, barely. The pain shot up through her raw palms and she bit down on it, and she did not go down and she did not cry. "That's what I thought," Brett said softly. "Nothing, you do nothing, because there's nothing you can do." He straightened up, satisfied, restored himself again. "See you tomorrow, Emily, and the day after." And the paw. And that was when the ground began to shake. At first, Emily thought it was her own exhaustion, a ringing in her ears, a trembling in her overtaxed body. Brett felt it too. She watched him feel it. She watched his grin falter as the sound rolled in from the far edge of campus, low and huge, a sound you felt in your sternum before you heard it in your ears. It was the sound from last night, the sound of a motorcycle, except it wasn't one motorcycle. It grew, and it kept growing, and it didn't resolve into a single engine. The way it had the night before it thickened, it multiplied. It became a wall of sound rolling toward the quad from the direction of the main road, and every head on the quad turned toward it, and students stopped mid-step, and somebody's coffee cup slipped out of their hand and shattered on the pavement, and nobody even looked. They came around the corner by the library 4 abreast. Then 8, then 12, motorcycles, big ones, chrome, catching the gray morning light, rolling slow and deliberate and absolutely unhurried onto the campus, in a column that did not seem to end. 20, 30. Riders in black leather vests, gray beards and young hard faces, both filling the main drive, and then the edge of the quad, and then the quad itself, engines rumbling, like something geological, like the ground itself had decided to speak. Emily's mouth had fallen open. She wasn't breathing. They kept coming. 40, 50. They rolled in and they fanned out and they positioned themselves, and this was the thing that made the watching students go silent. This was the thing that made a professor drop his briefcase. They positioned themselves with a kind of order, a kind of discipline, no shouting, no revving for show, just an overwhelming, controlled, undeniable arrival. 60, 70 men and machines filling the heart of the campus, and then one by one in a rippling wave that started at the front and moved back through the whole column, they cut their engines. And there was silence. A silence so total that Emily could hear her own heartbeat. At the front of the column, one rider swung his leg off his bike slow, with a hitch in his step, and Emily's breath left her in a rush because she knew that stride. She knew that gray beard, those pale gray eyes, that black vest. Jack Sullivan. He'd come back. He walked toward her across the silent quad, unhurried, and behind him 70 men stood beside their machines and watched. And every student, and every professor, and every staff member on that quad watched too. And nobody moved, and nobody breathed. And Jack Sullivan crossed all that silence and stopped in front of a 22-year-old girl on drugstore crutches and said gently, like there was nobody else there at all, "Morning, Emily. Sorry we're a few minutes late. Traffic coming in from Spokane." Emily made a sound that was half a laugh and and entirely involuntary. "You came back," she whispered. "I told you I would." He said it simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world, like the idea of not coming back had never once crossed his mind. "I told you weren't going to do this alone anymore. I'm a man who keeps his word." He glanced past her at Brett, who had gone the color of paper and hadn't moved a muscle since the first bike came around the corner. Jack looked at him for a long, flat moment and then deliberately turned his back on him, the most complete dismissal Emily had ever witnessed, and gave Brett Callahan exactly none of his attention. Instead, he reached back, and one of the riders behind him stepped forward and put a long, flat case into his hands. "Now," Jack said, "before we get to anything else, first things first, same as last night." He knelt down slow, his old knees popping so that he was at her level, and he opened the case on the ground in front of her. Inside, resting on foam, were a pair of crutches. But not like any crutches Emily had ever seen. They were carbon fiber matte black, impossibly light-looking, the grips molded from some soft, dark material, the whole design clean and elegant, and she felt her heart stop exactly like her prototype, exactly like the blueprint on her wall. Better. Refined. Perfected. "I don't understand," she breathed. "You got a picture of your design online," Jack said. "On your little project page, buried where nobody looks. One of my brothers found it last night, Tommy back there. He does custom fabrication, builds bike parts, real artist with carbon fiber." He nodded at a huge tattooed man near the front who lifted 2 fingers in a shy little wave. "We've been up all night, whole crew of us in Tommy's shop. Your design, Emily. We just built the thing you already invented. Only took us till about 4 to get the grips right." He lifted them out of the case and held them up to her, and his gray eyes were wet again. "Try 'em, sweetheart. Tell me if we got it right. You're the engineer. You'd know." Emily's hands were shaking so hard she could barely take them. She dropped the hateful drugstore crutches, and they clattered on the pavement, and she took the black carbon fiber ones, and she got them under her arms, and she settled her weight onto them. And they fit. They fit like they'd been grown for her body. The grips cradled her raw palms without a single point of pressure on the torn skin. The height was perfect. The balance was perfect. For the first time in 14 months, standing on the things she had designed for her father, and every father like him actually holding it in the world, instead of on a blueprint. Emily Carter stood up straight, and it didn't hurt, and she looked at 70 strangers who had stayed up all night to build her a dream, and the wall came down completely, and she wept. She wept standing up in the middle of the quad on crutches that fit in front of 70 bikers and 100 students, and she didn't try to hide it, and she didn't try to stop it. Jack got back to his feet, slow, and he didn't touch her, didn't hug her. He seemed to understand that if he did, she'd come apart entirely. He just stood beside her close so she'd know he was there, and he let her cry. "They fit," she got out finally. "Jack, they fit nobody's ever. I've never even felt what they were supposed to feel like." "They fit because your design's good," Jack said. "That's not us. That's you. We just followed the blueprint of somebody who knew exactly what she was doing." He said it loud enough to carry. He wanted the quad to hear it. "You hear that, everybody? This young woman right here designed these. Herself, for veterans who can't afford the $4,000 version." His voice rolled out across the silent quad, and it had steel in it now. "You've all been walking past her for months. Some of you watched a boy break her crutches in the rain last night, and you kept on walking. I know because I watched you do it." He turned in a slow circle, taking in the crowd, the students, the professors, all of them. "Take a good look at her now, because you're going to be hearing her name for a long time." The silence held, and then from somewhere in the crowd of students, one person began hesitantly to clap, and then another, and then a professor, and then it spread and rose and became something, a real sound, 100 people applauding a girl they'd walked past for 6 months and Emily stood in the middle of it on her carbon fiber crutches and could not stop crying. It was Brett who broke it. "This is insane," he said too loud, his voice cracking up an octave. He'd found his nerve again, the wrong kind, the desperate kind. You can't bring a gang onto a college campus. This is private property. Somebody call the cops, call security." Jack turned around at last and looked at him. "Go ahead," he said mildly. "Call them. We'll wait." "You're threatening people." "Am I?" Jack spread his empty hands. "Son, count 'em. 70 men, not one weapon, not one raised voice. Not one of us has laid a finger on a single person or a single thing. We rode our motorcycles, which are street legal, down a public drive, and we parked, which we're allowed to do, and we're standing here quiet watching." His voice hardened. "You want to call the police and explain to them that 70 men standing quietly made you uncomfortable? Go right ahead. And while they're here, maybe you can explain to them about last night, about the crutches in the storm drain. There's 15 witnesses and about 40 phones that got the whole thing on video." He tilted his head. "That's what you're afraid of, isn't it, Brett? Not us. You're afraid of the one thing you've never had to deal with in your whole life." He let it land. Witnesses. And Emily watched it happen, watched the exact moment Brett Callahan understood that his father's name on the science building was not going to save him from 70 silent men and 40 cell phone cameras. She watched him look around and for the first time actually see it, the phones all up, all recording, capturing every word out of his mouth. She watched the arrogance drain out of him and pure animal panic flood in behind it. "You don't know who my father is," he said, but it came out weak now, pleading almost. "You keep saying that," Jack said. "You know what I've noticed about men who keep saying that? They've usually never done a single thing worth being known for themselves." It was almost word for word what he'd said the night before, and Emily realized he'd said it on purpose, was giving it back to him, was making the whole quad hear the boy's only defense revealed for the hollow thing it was. "Where's your father right now? Brett, he here? He gonna come stand next to you?" Jack looked around theatrically. "No, just you." "Huh? Funny. She's got 70 people standing next to her." He nodded at Emily. "And she never even asked for one." That was the moment the doors of the administration building opened. A cluster of people came hurrying out, the dean of students, 2 associate deans, a woman from the provost's office, and behind them, red-faced and furious, the head of campus security with 4 officers. They came across the quad in a tight, anxious knot, and the crowd of students parted for them, and Emily felt her stomach drop because this was the part she knew. This was the part where the institution showed up, and the institution always took the side of the Callahans. "What in God's name is going on here?" The dean of students demanded, a tall, silver-haired man named Whitfield, whom Emily had emailed 4 times about Brett and who had never once replied. "Who is responsible for this? This is a functioning university campus. You cannot simply—" "Dean Whitfield," Brett said, lunging toward him, his voice flooding with relief. "Dean Whitfield, thank God these people, this gang, they just showed up and started threatening me. You have to—" "Nobody threatened anybody," a student's voice cut in. Everyone turned. It was the boy from the fountain the night before, the 19-year-old with the nice face who'd looked at Emily on the ground and thought about helping and then walked away. He'd stepped forward out of the crowd and his face was pale and his voice was shaking, but he said it again louder. "Nobody threatened anybody. They rode in and they built her new crutches. That's all that's happened." He swallowed hard, and then he did the thing that Emily would remember, the thing that cost him something, the thing that started everything that came after. He turned to the dean and he said, "But I saw what happened last night. I was right there. Brett broke her crutches on purpose and threw them in the storm drain and he called her names, and there were like 15 of us and none of us did anything." His voice broke. "I didn't do anything. I felt sick about it all night, and I've got it on video, the whole thing. I filmed it and I didn't even help her. I just filmed it and I'm so—" He looked at Emily and his eyes were wet. "I'm so sorry. I should have helped you. I'm so sorry." The quad was dead silent. Dean Whitfield looked at the boy. He looked at Emily. He looked at the phone in the boy's shaking hand, and Emily watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. The same calculation she'd seen behind the eyes of every administrator she'd ever begged for help. How do I make this go away with the least cost to the institution? Except this time, for the first time, the math was different. This time, there were 40 phones and 70 witnesses and a boy with a video, and the cost of making it go away had suddenly become much, much higher than the cost of doing the right thing. That's a lie, Brett said, but nobody was looking at him anymore. Is it? Said another voice, a girl this time. A student Emily half recognized from her statics class. She stepped forward, two arms crossed, jaw set. Because it happened to me in September. Not the crutches, I'm not disabled, but the same guy, same nastiness. I reported it. Nothing happened. She looked at Whitfield. I reported it to your office, and nothing happened. So don't stand there and act surprised. And then it was like a dam breaking. Another student stepped forward, and another. A young man near the back said Brett had shoved him down a staircase and called it an accident. A girl said he'd cornered her at a party. One after another, voices that had been silent for months, for years, rising up out of the crowd. Now that for the first time it looked like speaking might actually be safe. Now that somebody had shown them what it looked like when people refused to walk away. Emily stood in the middle of it on her carbon fiber crutches, and she understood something that made her breath catch. It had never been just her. It had never been just October. Brett Callahan had been doing this to people for years, and every single one of them had done exactly what she'd done. Made themselves small, absorbed. It gotten past, it told themselves nothing could be done because there was nothing that could be done. And all it had taken to break it open was 70 strangers refusing to let one girl stand alone. Jack Sullivan hadn't said a word through any of it. He'd stepped back. He'd let it happen. And Emily realized that too was deliberate, that he'd known somehow that if he'd stood there making demands, it would have stayed his fight in Old Biker versus the school. But he'd made it Emily's fight, and then he'd made it everyone's fight, and now it belonged to the whole quad, to all these students finding their voices at once, and there was nothing Dean Whitfield could do to make it go away. Enough, Whitfield said, but weakly. No, said the girl from statics. It's not enough. It hasn't been enough for a really long time. Whitfield's face had gone gray. He looked at the head of security, who looked back at him with an expression that said very clearly, do not put this on me. He looked at the woman from the provost's office, who had her own phone out now and was typing rapidly. He looked at the crowd, and finally, cornered, exposed, out of options for the first time in his comfortable career, he looked at Emily. Miss Carter, is it? You know my name, Emily said quietly. I emailed you 4 times. Something flickered across his face. Shame, maybe, or just the recognition of a losing position. Miss Carter, I think it's clear that there are serious allegations here that the university takes that we will be looking into thoroughly. And when, said Jack. It was the first time he'd spoken in several minutes, and his voice cut through the dean's fumbling like a blade. I'm sorry. You said you'll be looking into it. I'm asking when. Jack stepped forward, unhurried, and stopped in front of the dean, and though he never raised his voice and never made a single threatening move, the sheer, settled weight of him made Whitfield take a half step back. See, that's the word I've been waiting to hear. Thoroughly. Looking into. Those are the words institutions use when they mean never. I've heard them my whole life. My brother heard them his whole life. His pale eyes held the dean's. So I'm going to ask you a real specific question, and I'd like a real specific answer in front of all these witnesses. Is that boy going to be in class with this young woman tomorrow morning? Yes or no? That's not, there are processes. Yes or no, Dean? You can't expect me to, because here's what's going to happen, Jack said, and still, he was calm. And that was the terrifying thing. That was the thing that had Whitfield sweating through his collar. Nobody here is going to do anything today but ride home. We're going to leave peaceful as we came in about 5 minutes. But that video's already going up, tonight, all 40 of them. And every one of these students who just found their voice, they're going to keep talking because they've figured out it's safe now. And by this time next week, the whole state is going to know the name of the school that lost a disabled girl's incident reports 4 times while the dean's donor's son broke her crutches in the rain. He paused. Or this school does the right thing starting today and gets to be the school that took it seriously. Those are the 2 stories. You get to pick which one, but you're picking today, right now, in front of everybody. Emily watched Dean Whitfield understand that he had lost. Not to 70 bikers, not to threats, to something he had no defense against it at all, the simple, public, undeniable truth spoken out loud in front of too many witnesses to bury. "Mr. Callahan," Whitfield said slowly, turning to Brett, and his voice had changed entirely. "I'm going to need you to come with me to my office, immediately, and I'd suggest you contact your father and have him meet us there." "What?" Brett's voice went shrill. You're taking her side. Do you know what my dad gives this school every—" "Which is exactly the kind of statement," said the woman from the provost's office, looking up from her phone for the first time, "that we're now going to have to be extremely careful about, given the circumstances." She looked at the crowd at the phones, and she chose visibly in that moment to be on the right side of the coming story. "Effective immediately, Mr. Callahan, you're suspended pending a full investigation. You'll surrender your campus access. And Dean Whitfield," she turned to him cool, "the provost is going to want a complete account of every prior report involving this student that came through your office. Everyone, starting with Miss Carter's 4 emails." Whitfield's mouth opened and closed. Brett looked around wildly at the dean, who wouldn't meet his eyes at the provost's woman, who'd already turned away at the students filming him, at the 70 silent men, at Emily standing straight and calm on her new black crutches. And Emily watched the whole architecture of his life, the certainty that his name would always, always protect him, collapse in real time on his face. "This isn't over," he said. "It came out cracked and small. And Emily Carter, who 12 hours ago had lain in a gutter in the rain, while this boy called her names and 15 people walked away, looked him dead in the eye and said in a voice that carried clear across the silent quad, 'You're right, it's not.' She adjusted her grip on the crutches she had designed for her father. It's just finally started." Brett had no answer for that. There was no answer for that. 2 security officers stepped toward him, and he flinched away from them. And then, with nowhere left to go and nothing left to say, he let himself be walked toward the administration building, and the crowd parted for him, and every phone tracked him the whole way. And he went from the most untouchable person on that campus to the most exposed in the space of about 8 minutes, and the doors closed behind him. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the applause started again, bigger this time, longer. The whole quad and students were coming toward Emily. Now the girl from Statics, the boy from the fountain, a dozen others' faces she'd passed for months, all of them wanting to say something, to apologize, to thank her, to tell their own stories. And it was too much. It was all too much. And Emily turned to find the one steady thing in the middle of all of it. Jack was already looking at her. He hadn't moved to accept any of it. Not the applause, not the thanks. He'd stepped back to the edge again, back toward the column of bikes and the 70 men who were. Emily now noticed already beginning to quietly climb back onto their machines. They hadn't come for this. The applause, the cameras, the crowd. They'd done the thing they came to do, and now they were, without any fuss at all, preparing to leave. Emily made her way to him through the crowd. It was easy now. The crutches fit. She stopped in front of him, and she didn't have any words big enough, so she just said, "You're leaving." "We are." Jack nodded. "This was never our fight to be in the middle of, sweetheart. It's yours, always was. We just came to even up the numbers for a minute so you could take your ground." He glanced at the crowd behind her, all those students. "And look, you didn't even need us for the hard part. You did that yourself. Them kids finding their voices, that wasn't 70 bikers. That was them watching one girl refuse to be small. That was you. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't thank me." He said it firmly, gently. "That's not how this works. You know how you thank me." He nodded down at the crutches. "You build the next pair, and the pair after that. You take that project of yours, and you make it real for every Danny out there, every one of your daddy's brothers who's been handed junk and told to be grateful. That's how you pay this back, not to me. Forward, you pay it forward." His eyes crinkled. "And if you ever get it off the ground and you need somebody to move a shipment of 100 wheelchairs across 4 states in a weekend," he jerked his thumb back at the 70 men on their bikes, "well, you got our number now." Emily laughed, wet and helpless. "Jack, one more thing." He reached into his vest and took out something small and pressed it into her hand, folding her fingers over it. When she opened them, it was a photograph, creased and old, a younger Jack, and beside him in a wheelchair, a grinning younger man with the same pale gray eyes. "That's Danny," Jack said quietly. "I want you to keep that. I want you to put it up on that wall of yours next to your daddy. And when the work gets hard, and it's gonna get hard, and you feel like you're doing it all alone again, his voice thickened, and he had to stop and start over. You look at those two men, and you remember that you are not building crutches, Emily. You are building the thing that should have existed when they needed it. You're finishing what nobody finished for them. He closed her hand around the photo. That's not a small thing you're doing. That's about the biggest thing there is. Emily looked down at the photograph of a man she'd never meet, brother, to a man she'd known for 12 hours. And she understood finally all the way down that everything that had happened since that motorcycle first cut through the rain had never really been about Brett Callahan at all. "I'll finish it," she whispered. "I promise you, I'll finish it." Jack Sullivan looked at her for a long moment. This girl who reminded him so much of the fight his brother never got to have, and then he did the only thing left to do. He nodded once the way one soldier nods to another, and he turned with his hitching step, and he walked back to his motorcycle, and he swung his leg over it, and behind him 70 engines came alive at once, in a rolling wave of thunder that shook the windows of the administration building, where somewhere inside a boy was calling his father and finding out for the first time in his life that it wasn't going to be enough. They rode out the way they'd come in slow-ordered, unhurried 70 men who'd driven through the night from 4 states to make sure one girl didn't have to stand alone, and who wanted nothing at all in return. Not thanks, not credit, not even to stay and watch it land. Emily stood at the edge of the quad on the crutches they'd built her, and she watched the column roll away toward the main road and get smaller, and the thunder get fainter, and Jack Sullivan never looked back, and that she understood was its own kind of gift, a man who did the right thing and then simply left so that the victory would belong to her and not to him. The thunder faded to a rumble, and the rumble faded to nothing, and then they were gone, and it was just Emily and a quad full of students who would never walk past her the same way again, and a photograph of 2 brothers warming in her closed hand, and the very first morning of the rest of a life that was never ever going to be small again. The video went up that night, and by morning, Emily Carter's world had changed shape entirely. She woke to her phone buzzing itself off the nightstand. Not one notification. Hundreds. The boy from the fountain, his name was Marcus. She'd learned Marcus Reyes had posted his footage exactly as he'd promised, all of it, the rain and the crutches going into the storm drain, and Brett's voice saying the words, and 15 people walking away. He'd titled it plainly with no drama. "This happened at my school last night. I filmed it and did nothing. I'm posting it so I can't pretend I didn't." And then spliced onto the end, someone else's footage from the morning after 70 motorcycles rolling onto the quad engines, cutting to silence an old man kneeling to hand a girl a pair of carbon fiber crutches. 2 million views before Emily had finished her first cup of coffee. She sat at her tiny kitchen table and watched the number climb and felt something close to vertigo. She'd spent 14 months being invisible. She'd spent 6 of those months being tormented in a silence so complete that she'd begun to wonder if it was even real, if maybe she was the problem, if maybe she was imagining how bad it was. And now 2 million strangers had watched it happen, and there was no more wondering. It was real. It had always been real. The whole world could see it now. Danny's photograph was pinned to the wall beside her father's right, where Jack had told her to put it. She looked at the 2 of them, 2 men in wheelchairs, 2 grins, 2 lives that the world had decided didn't count for much. And she said out loud the way she still did, "You're not going to believe what's happening, Dad." Then her phone rang, not a text, a call, a number she didn't recognize, area code she didn't know. She almost didn't answer. She answered. "Is this Emily Carter, the engineering student?" "Who's asking?" "My name's Diane Foster. I'm a producer with a program out of Seattle Regional, but we syndicate. Miss Carter, that video is everywhere this morning, and the piece of it that nobody can stop talking about isn't the motorcycles. It's the crutches. Somebody in the comments said you designed them, that you're building affordable mobility equipment for veterans. Is that true?" Emily's hand tightened on the phone. It's a project. I don't have funding. It's just a student. How soon can you come talk to us?" And that was the first crack in the dam, the first hint that what Jack had set in motion on that quad was going to run a great deal further than a suspended athlete and an apology. Emily said yes because she didn't know how to say no, and she hung up and sat very still and thought, this is happening too fast. And under that thought, quieter and colder, this is exactly the kind of attention that makes powerful people decide to make it stop. She was right about that too, because 2 hours later, her phone rang again, and this time she did recognize the name on the screen, and her stomach dropped straight through the floor. Callahan R. Richard Callahan, Brett's father, the name on the science building. She had never spoken to the man in her life. She stared at the phone through 4 rings, and then because she had promised Jack she was done being small, she answered it. Miss Carter. The voice was smooth, warm, expensive, the same voice Brett had aged 30 years and sanded to a fine professional polish. I hope you'll forgive me calling you directly. I thought it was better than lawyers. I always think it's better than lawyers when it can be. How did you get my number? I've been a supporter of that university for 22 years, Miss Carter. I can get most things. A pause, gracious, letting the small threat breathe. I'm calling because I've seen the video, and I want to tell you first, and before anything else, that I am appalled by my son's behavior. Appalled. What he did to you was inexcusable, and I've told him so in no uncertain terms. Emily said nothing. She'd learned that trick from Jack. Silence made the other person keep talking, which is why Richard Callahan went on, I want to make this right. I want to make it right for you, Emily. May I call you Emily? Now, I understand you've got this Project Mobility Equipment Veterans, and I have to tell you, as the son of a man who served that mission, is close to my heart. His voice was so warm. It was the warmth of a fireplace in a house you were about to be robbed inside. I'd like to fund it, fully. I'm talking about real money, Emily, enough to take that project out of the machine shop and turn it into a company. Enough to change your entire life today. There it was. Emily closed her eyes. She'd known it was coming the second she saw the name. And still hearing it enough to change your entire life today? Some small, starving part of her, the part that had $11 until Friday, the part that had watched her father get handed junk equipment because there was no money for better, the part that wanted so badly to actually build the thing, instead of just dreaming it, that part of her leaned toward the warmth. And in return, she said, in return, nothing. I told you I want to make it right. In return for what, Mr. Callahan? A pause. When he spoke again, the warmth was still there, but there was a floor of steel under it now, and he let her hear it because he wanted her to understand this was a serious offer between serious people. In return, he said, I'd want us to move forward together, constructively. I'd want you to release a short statement. I'll have it written for you. You won't have to lift a finger, saying that you and Brett have reached a private understanding, that you consider the matter resolved, and that you're asking people to stop sharing the video out of respect for everyone's privacy, including yours. And I'd want you to withdraw your cooperation from the university's little investigation. It's a distraction, Emily. It doesn't help your veterans. It just ruins a 21-year-old's life over one bad night in the rain. A breath. Everybody makes mistakes at 21. You wouldn't want to be defined forever by your worst night, would you? Neither does he. And there it was laid out clean. Take the money, take the company, take the future you've dreamed of for 14 months, and in exchange, let Brett kill the investigation, tell everyone it's resolved, and go quiet. Forever. Emily's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it. Because God help her, it was tempting. It was so tempting. She could have everything she'd ever working for right now today. She could build the crutches, the chairs, all of it. For her father, for Danny, for every veteran handed garbage and told to smile. All she had to do was be small one more time. Mr. Callahan, she said slowly, can I ask you something? Of course. That girl from my statics class, she reported Brett in September, and a boy said Brett shoved him down a staircase. And there were others, there were a lot of others yesterday in the quad. All these people he's heard over the years. She kept her voice very even. When you offer to make it right for me, you're only offering to make it right for me, aren't you? Just me, the one with the video. The others don't get a company. The others just get told it's resolved. A pause. You're not trying to fix what your son did. You're trying to buy the one witness whose story got 2 million views. Silence on the line. A long one. When Richard Callahan spoke again, all the warmth was gone. I'm going to give you some advice, Miss Carter, and I'd take it seriously if I were you, because I'm only going to offer it once. His voice had gone flat and cold and utterly certain, and Emily understood she was hearing the real man now, the one under the fireplace warmth. You're a 22-year-old student with $11 in your bank account and a project that lives on a website nobody visits. I'm a man who has spent 30 years building relationships with everyone who matters in this state. You have had one good day, one. You think the internet is on your side. The internet forgets in a week, but I don't forget. And I have a very long reach and a very long memory and a great deal of patience. A pause to let it land. I am handing you the future you say you want on a silver platter for the small price of not destroying my son over one rainy night. And if you're foolish enough to throw that away, if you decide you'd rather be a martyr than an engineer, then I promise you, Emily, you will spend the next 10 years discovering exactly how many doors a man like me can close. Every grant, every investor, every duo, every one of them has a person on the other end who takes my calls. A breath. So, do we have an understanding? Emily's hands were shaking again, but not the way they'd shaken in the rain. She thought about her father in his broken wheelchair being grateful. She thought about Danny in the photograph. She thought about a girl in the gutter with $100 bill dissolving in front of her and a man's voice saying, "Keep it, you're going to need it more than me." She thought about 70 men who rode through the night and wanted nothing, nothing at all in return, and how the one thing that would dishonor every mile of that ride would be to take the money and go quiet. "Mr. Callahan," she said, and her voice didn't shake at all, "I threw $100 back at your son in the rain 2 nights ago. You really thought a bigger number would work better on me. Miss Carter, I designed those crutches on the floor of my dead father's workshop so that men like him would stop being handed garbage by people who figured they'd be grateful for anything. And you just called me a girl who does that and offered me garbage and figured I'd be grateful." She was crying now, but they were the other kind of tears, the hot, furious, clean kind. "So no, we don't have an understanding. I'm cooperating with the investigation, all of it, and I'm not asking anybody to take down that video. And when that producer from Seattle asks me tomorrow why I turned down a fully funded company, I'm going to tell her exactly what you just said to me on this phone, word for word, because I remember things too, Mr. Callahan, and I've got a real good memory for the exact moment somebody shows me who they are." Dead silence. "You just made a very serious mistake," Richard Callahan said quietly. "No," Emily said. "For the first time in 6 months, I didn't." And she hung up on the most powerful man in the state. She sat there afterwards, shaking so hard she had to put the phone down flat on the table. Because the thing about defiance is that it feels magnificent for about 90 seconds, and then the fear arrives, and the fear was arriving now, cold and total, because Richard Callahan hadn't been bluffing. She could hear it in his voice. Every grant, every investor, every job. He would do exactly what he said. She just traded a funded future for a powerful enemy, and she was 22, and she had $11, and she was once again completely alone against something enormous. Except, she looked at her closed hand where she'd been unconsciously gripping something the whole phone call. She opened it, Danny's photograph, and under it, the corner of Jack's blue bandana, the one she'd never given back. And she remembered what he'd said, "If you ever get it off the ground and you need somebody, you got our number now." She had his number. He'd made her save it in the diner. She'd told herself she'd never use it, that it would be an imposition that these men had already given so much. She called it. He picked up on the second ring, that gravel voice. And before he even said hello, Emily was talking fast, the whole thing pouring out of her. The video, the producer, and then Richard Callahan, the offer, the threat, all of it, every grant, every investor, every job, and how she'd hung up on him. And now she was terrified she'd just destroyed her own future. And Jack listened to all of it without saying one word. And when she finally ran out of breath, there was a long pause. And then Jack Sullivan started to laugh. It wasn't a mean laugh. It was warm, delighted, the laugh of a man who has just heard the best news he's had in years. "Jack, why are you laughing? I just made the most powerful man in the state my enemy." "Sweetheart," he was still chuckling, "you want to know how I know you're gonna be just fine? You want to know how I know you're the real thing?" He took a breath. "Because a man offered you everything you've ever wanted, and all you had to do was be quiet, and you told him to go to hell. In 6 months, I've watched 100 good causes die because somebody finally waved enough money at the person in charge. And you just turned it down flat at 22 with $11 to your name." His voice had gone thick. Emily, that's the whole thing. That's the entire ballgame right there. Money didn't buy you. You have no idea how rare that is. No idea. But he's going to close every door. He's going to try. Jack's voice hardened into something certain. Now listen to me, because this is the part that matters. You think Richard Callahan invented having a long reach? You think he's the only man in this state who knows people? A pause. Emily, I've been riding these roads for 40 years. You know how many veterans are in my club? You know how many of my brothers spent their whole lives being handed the exact junk equipment you're trying to fix? That producer in Seattle. You go on that show, you tell your story, and you tell it clean, and you tell him about your daddy and about Danny. And you let me make a few calls of my own. Because a man like Callahan trades in favors from people who matter. But there's another kind of power in this world, sweetheart, and it don't take his calls, and it can't be closed with a phone call, and there's a whole lot more of us than there are of him. His voice dropped. You are not alone in this. I told you that in the rain, and I meant it then, and I mean it now. He closes a door, we'll open a window. He calls an investor, we'll find you 10. You just keep telling the truth and refusing to be bought. That's your only job. The rest of it, the doors, you leave that to your brothers. Emily was crying again. Why are you doing all this? You barely know me. Danny's gone. You don't owe me anything. Jack, you don't owe anybody anything. And there was a long pause on the line, and when Jack spoke again, his voice had changed, gone quiet and raw, in a way she hadn't heard from him before, even in the diner. You want to know the real reason, he said. The one I didn't tell you the first night. A breath. The night Danny got hurt. The accident. I was supposed to be there. I was supposed to be driving him home. And I blew it off because I had somewhere better to be, some party, I don't even remember whose. And he caught a ride with somebody else. And that's the ride that put him in the chair for 30 years. His voice cracked all the way through. 30 years I've carried it. That, Emily, 30 years knowing that if I'd just shown up when I said I would, my brother walks. And I couldn't fix it. There was no fixing it. He's gone now, and I never got to make it right. A long breath steadying himself. And then 2 nights ago, I'm riding home in the rain, and I see a girl on the ground, and something says, show up. And this one time I did. So you asked me why I'm doing this. His voice was fierce now, and wet, and absolutely certain. I'm doing it because I've got 30 years of showing up to make up for, and God finally handed me a way to start. You're not a burden to me, Emily. You're a gift. You let me be the man I should have been for Danny. So don't you ever, ever ask me again why. You just let me show up. That's all I want. Just let me show up. Emily couldn't speak. She sat with the phone pressed to her ear and cried, and 3,000 miles of nothing on the line, and an old man crying too quietly on the other end, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because there was nothing that needed saying. Okay, she managed finally. Okay, I'll go on the show. I'll tell the truth. That's my girl, Jack said softly. That's all you gotta do. Tell the truth and let us handle the doors. She went on the show 3 days later. She almost didn't make it. The morning of, she got an email from the university machine shop revoking her after-hours access, no reason given, effective immediately. An hour later, the small grant she'd been quietly counting on from the engineering department, $2,000, was rescinded, a curt note citing reallocation of resources. By noon, a company that had verbally agreed to let her test her wheelchair frame at their facility had gone silent and stopped returning her calls. Richard Callahan was keeping his promise. Door after door, quiet and clean and deniable, closing one by one exactly as he'd said, and there was no fingerprint on any of it. Nothing you could point to. Nothing you could prove, just a girl's whole support structure evaporating in the space of a morning. She called Jack in a panic. He didn't panic. Go on the show, he said. Tell the truth. Trust me. So she went on the show, shaking in her one good shirt, and Diane Foster asked her about the video and about Brett, and Emily told it plain. And then Diane asked about the project, and Emily's voice steadied the way it always did when she talked about the work. And she told them about her father and his broken chair, and about the crutches on the workshop floor, and about the mission. And then Diane asked the question Jack had told her would come. Emily, I have to ask, a project like this needs funding. Have you had any offers? And Emily looked into the camera and she thought about 70 men in the rain, and she said, I had one. 3 days ago, Richard Callahan called me personally and offered to fully fund my company. A pause while Diane's eyebrows went up. In exchange for dropping my cooperation with the investigation into his son, releasing a statement saying it was all resolved and asking everyone to stop sharing the video. He told me if I refused, he'd close every door in the state to me. Every grant, every investor, every job. She held the camera's eye. And I want to say right now on the record, since I turned him down, I've lost my lab access, my department grant, and a testing partnership, all in the last 3 days. I'm not saying who did that. I can't prove anything. A breath. I'm just telling you what happened. And I'm telling you I'd do it again. Because I'm not for sale, and neither is the truth about what his son did. Diane Foster was staring at her. The crew behind the cameras had gone still. Emily, Diane said slowly, you understand what you're saying on the air about one of the most powerful men in this state? Yes, ma'am, Emily said. I understand exactly what I'm saying. The segment aired that night. By the next morning, it had 8 million views, and the story had stopped being about a broken pair of crutches and become something much bigger and much more dangerous to Richard Callahan than his son's bad night in the rain. Because now it was about the cover-up. Now it was about a powerful man trying to buy and then threaten a 22-year-old girl building wheelchairs for veterans. And that was a story with legs, a story that made people furious in a way the first video hadn't. And by noon, 2 actual journalists, the real kind investigative, with newspapers behind them, had called Emily asking if she'd go on the record. And then at 2 in the afternoon, her phone rang with a number she didn't know, and she answered it, and a woman's voice said, Miss Carter, please hold for the university president. Not the dean, not the provost's office, the president. Emily's heart hammered. She waited, and a new voice came on, older, careful, the voice of someone who had spent the last 24 hours watching a manageable scandal metastasize into an institutional catastrophe on live television. Miss Carter, thank you for taking my call. I'll be direct with you because I think you've earned that. A pause. I've spent this morning reviewing your file, all 4 of your emails to Dean Whitfield, the incident reports. The other students who've come forward there are now 11 of them, by the way, and I've watched your interview. A long breath. And I owe you an apology on behalf of this entire institution. We failed you, repeatedly, systematically, and I'm not going to insult you by pretending otherwise or by offering you something to make it quietly go away because I understand from your interview exactly how you feel about that kind of offer. Emily said nothing. Her hand was over her mouth. So here's what I'm going to do instead, the president said. Effective this morning, Dean Whitfield is on administrative leave pending a full external review of how his office handled student complaints, not just yours. All of them going back years. Brett Callahan's suspension is being converted to expulsion proceedings, and given the number of corroborating reports, I don't expect those proceedings to go his way. A pause. And Miss Carter, I want to be very clear about one more thing because I gather it's relevant. Neither Richard Callahan nor anyone else donates their way out of this. Not anymore. Not after what the whole country watched last night. Whatever he may have threatened you with his influence over this university ended at approximately 8 o'clock yesterday evening when your interview aired. He simply doesn't have the reach he thinks he has. Not here, not now. Emily was crying silently, the phone shaking in her hand. There's one more thing, the president said, and now something shifted in his voice, something almost gentle. Your lab access, your department grant. I understand they were revoked this week. Yes, Emily whispered. They've been reinstated as of an hour ago, and I've asked the Dean of Engineering to meet with you personally about what the university can do to actually support your project, not as an apology not to buy your silence, but because I watched 8 million people fall in love with what you're trying to build, and it would be a disgrace if the school that failed you also let it die. A pause. You've got a machine shop, Miss Carter. You've got a grant. And you've got a university president who is going to be watching very carefully to make sure nobody closes a single door in your face ever again. Are we clear? We're clear, Emily managed. She hung up and she sat at her little kitchen table in front of the 2 photographs on the wall, and she called Jack Sullivan. And when he picked up, she couldn't even get the words out. At first, she was crying too hard. Hey, Jack said. Emily, talk to me. What happened? What did he do? He lost. She got out. Jack Callahan lost. The president called. Brett's being expelled. Whitfield's gone. They reinstated my lab, my grant, everything he took. And the president said, he said Callahan's reach ended the second my interview aired. He said the money doesn't work anymore. She was laughing and crying at once. You were right. You were right about all of it. The other kind of power. There's more of us than there are of him. You were right. And on the other end of the line, 70 miles away, an old biker who'd carried 30 years of a debt he could never pay, closed his eyes and let out a long, shaking breath. And when he spoke, his voice was so full it barely came out at all. No, sweetheart, Jack Sullivan said. You were right. I just gave you a couple minutes of not being alone. You did the rest. You did every bit of the rest. A pause. Danny would have, he stopped, started again. Danny would have liked you. He'd have liked you an awful lot. I wish I could have met him, Emily whispered. Yeah, Jack said softly. Me too, but you're building the thing he never got. So in a way, his voice broke. In a way, you kinda did. In a way, you're gonna know him better than anybody. They stayed on the line a while longer, not saying what an old man and a young woman who'd been strangers a week ago and were something else entirely. Now something neither of them had a name for yet, but that both of them understood was going to last. And outside Emily's window, the afternoon went on, and 8 million people kept sharing the story of the girl who wouldn't be bought. And somewhere across the state, a powerful man sat in a quiet office and discovered for the first time in 30 years that there was something his money couldn't reach. The doors that had slammed shut all began to open again, and they opened faster than anyone could have closed them. Within a week of the interview, Emily Carter had gone from a girl with $11 in a project nobody visited to a name people wanted attached to their own. The two investigative journalists ran their stories, and the stories were worse for Richard Callahan than anything Emily had said herself, because journalists talked to more than one person. They found the girl from Statics. They found the boy Brett had shoved down the staircase. They found a young woman who'd left the university 2 years earlier and never told anyone why, and who now finally told them. 11 students had come forward to the president. By the time the papers were done, it was 23. And every single one of them, Emily noticed, told a version of the same story. It happened to me. I reported it or I didn't. Nothing changed. I decided nothing could change. And then I saw a girl on a quad refuse to be small, and I realized I'd been wrong. She hadn't set out to be that. She'd set out to survive one more day. But that was the thing Jack had understood before she had, that the bravest thing one frightened person does in public gives permission to 100 frightened people watching. She'd become the permission. The offers came in a flood. A prosthetics company wanted to license her crutch design. A national veterans organization wanted her to speak at their conference. A venture fund out of California called a real one, the kind that had turned her father's whole generation of dreamers away, and offered to seed her a company with more money than she'd ever let herself imagine. And this time there were no strings, no statement to sign, no silence to buy, just money and a mission, and a girl who'd proven she couldn't be bought and had therefore become overnight the only kind of founder the smart money actually wanted. She said yes to the Veterans Conference. She said maybe to the venture fund. Let me think. Let me talk to some people first. And the people she meant were Jack. She'd fallen into the habit of calling him every evening. It had started as updates and become something else, something neither of them named. He'd tell her about the shop, about the brothers, about a run they were planning up the coast. She'd tell him about the offers, the fear, the strange new weight of being seen. And most nights before they hung up, one of them would bring up Danny or her father, and they'd sit together in the quiet with the two men they'd loved and lost, and it helped. It helped them both in a way that surprised them. You should come up, Jack said one evening, to the shop. Meet Tommy Proper, the one who built your crutches. Meet the crew. They ask about you, you know, every one of them. You're kind of a legend around here. I'd like that, Emily said and meant it. He paused and she heard something careful come into his voice. There's something I've been wanting to show you too. Something of Danny's. But it can wait till you're here. It's the kind of thing you show a person in person. She didn't press. She'd learned that Jack came to things in his own time, but the world didn't slow down to let her drive up the coast. Because Richard Callahan, it turned out, was not a man who lost quietly. The lawsuit landed on a Tuesday. Emily was in the machine shop, her access restored, her grant reinstated, actually building again for the first time in weeks, when her phone lit up with a call from a number marked only legal. She almost didn't answer. She answered. A crisp voice informed her that she was being sued by Richard Callahan for defamation, that her statements on the broadcast, specifically her claim that he had threatened to close doors and her implication that he was behind the loss of her lab access and grant, were false, damaging, and made with reckless disregard for the truth. That the suit sought damages in an amount that made Emily physically sit down on the concrete floor. That she would be receiving formal service shortly, and that Mr. Callahan's counsel wished her to know that the matter could still be resolved privately on the original terms should she reconsider. There it was again, the same offer, wearing a different, uglier mask. Emily sat on the floor of the machine shop with the phone in her lap and felt the fear come back all the way, the total cold childhood fear, because this was the thing she couldn't fight with courage. Courage was free. A lawyer was not. Richard Callahan could bury her in legal fees until she was 70, could make being right cost more than being wrong could win. Not because his case was good, but simply because he could afford to keep fighting, and she couldn't. That was the trap. That had always been the trap for people like her father, for people like Danny. The world didn't have to prove you wrong. It just had to make being right unaffordable. She called Jack. Her hands were shaking so hard she dropped the phone twice. He's suing me, she got out. Defamation. For Jack, the number, it's more money than exists. It's more than I'll make in my whole life. And his lawyer said, I can still make it go away if I take the original deal. Drop everything, go quiet. Her voice cracked. I can't fight this. I can fight a bully. I can fight the school, but I can't fight a lawsuit I don't have. I can't afford a lawyer. I can't afford 1 hour of a lawyer. Emily, breathe, stop and breathe. I got you, breathe. She breathed. Okay, Jack said, and his voice was so steady it steadied her. Now listen, this is what a man like Callahan does when he's already lost the real fight. He can't win in the world anymore. Everybody's seen the video. Everybody knows what his kid did. The school already threw the boy out. So he does the only thing he's got left. He tries to bankrupt you so it feels like he won. He wants you scared. He wants you to fold now, when it's almost over, because he knows he can't beat you any other way. A pause. He's not strong right now, sweetheart. He's desperate. There's a difference, and I need you to hold on to it. A strong man doesn't sue a broke 22-year-old. He does that because it's the last card he's got. But it's a card I can't beat. You can't, Jack agreed. But you're not going to be the one holding the cards. She heard him shift, heard something come into his voice, some old hardness she'd only glimpsed before. You remember I told you there's another kind of power in this world, the kind that doesn't take Callahan's calls. Yes. Well, here's the thing I never told you about the club. A pause. You know who rides with us? You know who spent 30 years being a brother to men like me? We got a fella named Sam, rode with us 15 years. And Sam, before he ever threw a leg over a bike, Sam spent 25 years as a trial lawyer. A good one, a mean one, the kind big firms are scared of. He got out, said he was tired of it, wanted to fix bikes and ride and be left alone. Emily heard something like a smile enter Jack's voice. But Sam had a brother too, Emily. Vietnam. Came home with one leg and got treated like garbage by the same system that treated your daddy and my Danny like garbage. And I already told Sam your whole story a week ago over a beer. And you know what Sam said? Jack's voice thickened. Sam said, ghost if that Callahan son of a bitch ever comes after that girl you called me before you finish the sentence. I will handle it for free and I will enjoy every minute of it. Emily couldn't breathe. There's a lawyer. There's a lawyer, Jack said. One of the best in the state, retired board and looking for exactly this fight. And he don't take Callahan's calls. And he can't be bought. And he don't care how deep the man's pockets are because Sam's got a pension and a motorcycle and nothing left to be afraid of. His voice went fierce and gentle at once. You hear me? You're not fighting this alone. You were never going to fight this alone. I told you in the rain every door he closes, we open a window. He brought a lawyer. We got a lawyer, and ours is meaner and ours is free, and ours has been waiting 30 years for a reason to be this angry at a man like Callahan. Emily put her face in her free hand and sobbed right there on the machine shop floor, and this time it was relief so total it hurt. Sam called her within the hour. He was exactly as advertised, a dry, unhurried voice with 40 years of courtrooms in it, and he listened to the whole thing without interrupting. And when Emily finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Miss Carter, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to actually hear it because you sound scared and you don't need to be. A pause. This lawsuit is the best thing that's happened to your case. You understand, for Callahan to win a defamation suit, he has to prove your statements were false, which means he has to put himself under oath. He has to sit for a deposition and answer my questions about whether he called you and what he said, and whether he made those threats, and whether he had anything to do with your grant getting pulled, all of it under oath with penalties for lying. Emily heard the smile, now cold and satisfied. He thinks he's suing you. What he's actually done is hand me the power to legally interrogate him in detail about everything he did. He's opened the door I could never have opened myself. Rich men always think the courthouse belongs to them. Sometimes it belongs to whoever isn't afraid of it. A beat. And I am not afraid of it. I haven't been afraid of it in 40 years. So here's what you're going to do, Emily. Nothing. You're going to build your crutches and go to your conference and live your life, and you're going to let me handle Richard Callahan. Can you do that? I can do that, Emily whispered. Good, one more thing. His dry voice softened just slightly. Ghost tells me you're building equipment for guys like my brother. Guys who got handed junk and told to be grateful. A pause. My brother's been gone 11 years. So you build that thing, kid. You build it right. And don't you dare let a man like Callahan scare you off it. That's not payment. That's the only thing I want out of this. You build it. I'll build it, Emily said. I promise. So she let go. It was the hardest thing she'd done, yet harder than the quad, harder than hanging up on Callahan, to hand the fear to somebody else and trust them to carry it. But she did it, and she drove up the coast to the shop the next weekend because Jack had asked her to, and because she wanted finally to put faces to the 70 men who'd ridden through the night for a stranger. They were nothing like she'd braced for. She'd half expected to feel out of place, a small blonde engineering student among big rough men. Instead, she walked into Tommy's shop and 70 weathered faces lit up like she was family come home for the holidays. Tommy, the huge tattooed one who'd built her crutches, got so shy and flustered, shaking her hand, that he knocked over a stack of parts, and the whole shop roared laughing at him. And Emily laughed too, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 14 months finally let go. They fed her. They showed her the shop where they'd built her crutches, the exact bench, the scraps of carbon fiber still in the bin. An old man named Roy pulled up his pant leg without ceremony to show her the prosthetic underneath and said, Korea, they gave me a hunk of junk in '54, and I've been paying to fix the fancy ones ever since. You really gonna make them affordable, Missy? 'Cause I'll be your first customer, and I'll tell every vet I know. And Emily had to turn away for a second so he wouldn't see her cry. And then when the day was winding down and the light was going gold, Jack took her aside, away from the noise, out to a quieter corner of the shop, and he had a wooden box in his hands, and his face was doing something she'd never seen it do, nervous. I told you there was something of Danny's I wanted to show you, he said, in person. He set the box on the workbench and opened it. Inside were papers, old ones yellowed, covered in cramped handwriting and rough pencil sketches. Emily leaned in, and her breath stopped. They were designs. Engineering designs, crude, unschooled, but unmistakable sketches of a wheelchair frame, a crutch grip, a mobility device, dozens of pages of them, a lifetime of them. Danny couldn't afford school, Jack said quietly. Never got the training, but he was smart, smarter than me by a mile, and he spent 30 years in that chair thinking about how they could have built it better, sketching it out, filling up notebooks with it, dreaming about a version that didn't hurt, that didn't break, that a regular fella could actually afford. His voice was barely holding. He used to say, Jackie, somebody's gonna build these someday. Somebody smart with the schooling I never got. I just hope I live to see it. Jack's hand rested on the papers. He didn't live to see it. He died 2 years ago with these notebooks in a box in my garage, and I thought that was the end of it. I thought his ideas died with him. He looked at Emily, and his eyes were streaming now, and he didn't wipe them. And then I pulled a girl up off the pavement in the rain of our friend, he said, and she told me she was building the exact thing my brother spent 30 years dreaming about. And Emily, his voice broke completely. Some of your designs. On your wall. The grip, especially the way you solve the pressure point. It's the same solution Danny drew. 30 years apart, no way either of you ever saw the other's work, and you found the same answer. The exact same answer. He pushed the box gently toward her. So I want you to have these. All of Danny's notebooks. Because I think you're the person he was praying would come along. The smart one with the schooling who was finally going to build it. I think that's you. I think it was always going to be you. Emily stood there with 30 years of a dead man's dreams in a wooden box in front of her, drawn by a brother of her father in everything but blood. And she understood that this, not the 70 bikes, not the lawyer, not the toppled, powerful man, this was the real reason all of it had happened. Two men in wheelchairs, a generation and a coastline, part dreaming the same dream and dying before they could build it. And a girl and an old biker brought together by a broken crutch in the rain to finish it for both of them. Jack, she said and couldn't get any further. You don't gotta say anything. He put a big hand on her shoulder. Just build it. Build it with Danny's notebooks open on the bench. And everyone you sell some vet who got handed junk his whole life gets handed something good instead. That's Danny's whole dream. That's your daddy's whole dream. You build it, sweetheart. That's all any of us ever wanted. Emily nodded, unable to speak, and she took the box in both arms and held it against her chest like something alive. And it was 3 weeks later, with Danny's notebooks open on her bench and the venture fund's money in an account with her name on it, and Sam, the biker lawyer, running Richard Callahan into the ground, that the call came that broke the case wide open. It was Sam. His dry voice, but there was something electric under it. Emily, sit down. A beat. I deposed Callahan yesterday, under oath. 6 hours. Another beat, and now the satisfaction was undisguised. He denied everything, of course. Denied the threats. Denied touching your grant. Denied the whole phone call, essentially said you'd fabricated it for attention. A pause. There was just one problem for Mr. Callahan. What? Emily breathed. You recorded the call. Emily's heart stopped. No, I didn't record. No, Sam said, and she could hear the grin. He did. Rich men like Callahan record everything. It's a habit. It's how they cover themselves. They've got assistants logging every call. His own office recorded that phone call, Emily, the one where he offered you the money and then threatened to close every door in the state. It was sitting in his own files. And when I subpoenaed his communications, and his people had to produce it because lying to a subpoena is a crime even Richard Callahan won't commit. Sam actually laughed a short, delighted bark. The man handed me the murder weapon, his own recording, of himself, saying every single word you told the world he said, word for word. Emily sat down on the floor for the second time in a month, but this time she was laughing and crying, because the trap Callahan had built to bury her had swallowed him instead, and the one piece of proof she'd never had, the thing that had made her sit shaking, unable to prove any of it, had come from his own careful, arrogant, self-protecting hands. So here's where we are, Sam said, and his voice had gone serious again, the closer laying it out. His defamation suit is dead. You can't defame a man by accurately reporting a threat he recorded himself making. It's over the second I file this, but that's the small part. A pause. The recording proves he threatened you, and it corroborates that your grant and lab access got pulled right after. That's not just a dead lawsuit anymore, Emily. That's potential witness intimidation. That's potential retaliation. That's the kind of thing that gets a man's name taken off a building instead of put on one. His voice dropped. I'm not going to sugarcoat what comes next because it's going to be a fight and it's going to be public. But I want you to understand something, and as of yesterday afternoon, you're not the one who has to be afraid anymore. He is. For the first time in 30 years, Richard Callahan is the one who has to be afraid. A beat. How does that feel, kid? Emily looked up at Danny's notebooks open on her workbench and her father's photograph. And Danny's beside it, two men who'd spent their lives being handed junk by people who figured they'd be grateful. Two men who'd never once gotten to watch the powerful be afraid. It feels, she said quietly, like it should have felt for a lot of people a long time ago. Yeah, Sam said softly. It should have. That's exactly right. That's the whole thing, isn't it? A pause. Now go build your crutches. Ghost tells me you've got Danny's notebooks. Use them. And let me go file the paper that ends Richard Callahan's good year. She hung up and she called Jack. And when he answered, she couldn't even speak for a moment. And then it all came out, the recording. His own recording, the trap sprung backward, Sam filing the paper that ended it, and on the other end of the line, Jack Sullivan was quiet for a long, long moment. And then he said in a voice thick with 30 years of grief, finally turning into something else. "You hear that, Danny? You hear that wherever you are, you old dreamer?" His voice broke. "Somebody smart finally came along. She's building your chairs. And she just brought down the kind of man that spent both our lives telling us to be grateful for garbage." A long breath. "You were right, little brother. Somebody came. Took me 30 years, but I finally showed up, and when I did, somebody came." He was crying openly now, and so was Emily, 300 miles of phone line between them, and both of them holding the same two men in the same broken hearts. "Thank you, Emily," Jack whispered. "Thank you for being the somebody. You have no idea. You have no idea what you gave a couple of old men and their dead brothers. No idea at all." Sam filed the paper that ended Richard Callahan's good year, and it ended it exactly the way he'd promised, not with a bang, but with the slow, public, undeniable collapse of a man who had spent 30 years believing he was untouchable. It started with the recording. Emily never leaked it. She never so much as touched the file. But a defamation suit is a matter of public record. And the moment Sam attached Callahan's own recording to his response and filed it with the court, it belonged to the world. And the world listened. 8 million people had already watched a girl on a broadcast say Richard Callahan had threatened her. Now those same 8 million could hear him do it in his own smooth, patient, expensive voice on a recording his own office had made. You will spend the next 10 years discovering exactly how many doors a man like me can close. There was no spinning that. There was no crisis firm on earth that could soften it. A man cannot survive being heard in his own words, threatening to destroy a 22-year-old who builds wheelchairs for veterans. The people who had liked him stopped returning his calls. The people who had feared him stopped being afraid. And the people who had never known his name learned it now attached forever to the worst thing he'd ever said out loud. He dropped the lawsuit inside a week. Sam had predicted that to the day. "A bully sues to make you afraid," he told Emily on the phone, dry and satisfied. "The second the suit stops making you afraid and starts making him afraid, he's got no use for it anymore. Watch, he'll fold his own hand." And he did. What surprised even Sam was how fast the rest of it came apart once the first piece went. The university, watching that recording go national, announced it would be reviewing all naming agreements, a sentence so bloodless that Emily almost missed what it meant. 11 days later, she happened to be walking to the machine shop in the early morning when she saw the workmen on the scaffolding, and she stopped and she watched them take the letters down off the front of the science building, one at a time. CAL. She stood on the wet path with her coffee going cold in her hand and watched a name that had loomed over her whole undergraduate life come down letter by letter, and she waited to feel triumph, and the triumph never came. What came instead was quieter and much stranger and much bigger. She felt her father watching. She felt Danny watching. Two men who had been told their entire lives to be grateful for junk to be quiet, to take what they were given and say thank you. And now, through her eyes, the two of them got to watch a powerful man's name come down off a wall. She didn't cheer. She just stood very still and let them see it through her. Brett was expelled. Not suspended, not counseled, not quietly transferred, expelled formally with a written finding attached to his permanent record that would surface in every background check in every graduate application for the rest of his life. 23 students came forward in the end. 23. Emily had spent 6 months believing she was the only one believing that maybe she was the problem. Maybe she was too sensitive, maybe it wasn't as bad as it felt. And it turned out there had been a line of wounded people stretching back years. Every one of them believing the same thing, every one of them made small and silent by the same certainty that nothing could be done. The boy who had been so sure his father's name would protect him forever learned at 21 that the name was the very thing that damned him. Because without the untouchability it had bought him, he was just a young man who had been cruel to a great many people over a great many years. And the world had simply finally decided to remember all of it at the same time. Emily never spoke to Brett again, but she thought about him more than she expected to. And this was the part that surprised her, never with hatred. Hatred would have been simpler. What she felt instead was something closer to a terrible clarity. She kept returning to the image of him on that quad. In the 8 minutes it took his whole life to fall apart, the moment he understood his father could not save him. How small he had looked, how the certainty had drained out of his face and left nothing behind it, because there had never been anything behind it. Just the name, just the untouchability. And when that was gone, there was no person there at all, just a frightened boy who had never once been made to become anyone because he'd never once been made to answer for anything. She said as much to Jack on the phone one night, months later, still turning it over. "You knew," she told him, "that first night in the rain. You told Brett there's men you can shove around and men you can't, and the whole trick of a life is learning to tell the difference before you find out the hard way. You knew the difference the whole time. You looked at him and you knew he was paper." Jack was quiet a moment, the way he got when she touched something true. "I knew he was paper," he said. "Rich men's sons, the untouched ones, they're almost always paper, Emily. Never been tested, so there's nothing in there but the shape of a man. You push, and there's no resistance because there's no one home." A pause. "But that's not the part I couldn't know. What I couldn't know that first night was whether you were steel." His voice roughened. "A lot of good people are paper too, sweetheart, and it's not their fault the world beats it into them. I've stood up for a lot of folks over the years, and more than half of them folded the second it got hard, the second somebody waved money or a lawyer, and I never once blamed them for it, because it's a hard world, and being brave costs more than most people have." A long breath. "But you didn't fold. Not when Callahan offered you the whole dream on a platter. Not when he sued you for more money than exists. Not once. Not for a second. And that's the thing I couldn't have known in the rain. I thought I was just pulling a scared girl up off the ground. Turned out I was pulling up the most stubborn, hard-headed, unbuyable creature I ever met in 66 years. She could hear the smile break through. "Danny would have loved you. I know I keep saying it, but there's things a man just has to say more than once." And then there was the company. That was the part that mattered most to Emily in the end, more than the letters coming off the building, more than Brett, more than the ruin of the man who'd threatened her. Because a story about justice is a fine thing to tell, but justice doesn't put a good crutch under a tired veteran's arm, and it doesn't take the pressure off a pair of torn-up palms, and it doesn't let a man cross his own kitchen without crying out. Only the work does that. The justice was the noise. The work was the point. She'd known that since she was a girl on the floor of her father's workshop, and she never once let the noise make her forget it. So she built it, and she built it right, and she built it slow. She took the venture money, the clean money, no statement to sign, no silence to buy, and she refused to let it change her. She hired carefully. She kept the prices low, even when every advisor she had told her gently, and then less gently, that she was leaving money on the table, that she could double her margins, and no one would blink. And every single time one of them said it, Emily thought about her father being handed a wheelchair, with a wheel that dragged and being told to be grateful, and she left the money on the table on purpose. And she went home and slept the deepest sleep of her life. She had decided a long time ago what her father's memory was worth, and it was worth more than a margin. She kept Danny's notebooks open on her workbench the whole time. Every product that came off her line had a piece of him built into it, the grip he'd solved 30 years before she independently found the same answer, the frame he'd sketched in the dark of a bad night, the folding hinge he'd dreamed up and never once gotten to hold in his hands. She made certain everyone who worked for her understood whose dreams they were building and why and what it had cost to get them onto that bench. She was not building a product. She was finishing two men's unfinished lives, and she never let anyone in that shop forget it, least of all herself. Roy from Korea was her first real customer. The old man from the shop who'd pulled up his pant leg to show her the prosthetic and told her he'd been paying to fix the fancy ones since 1954. She'd promised him that day, and Emily Carter did not break promises. She built his crutches herself by hand, the best pair she'd ever made, and she didn't ship them. She drove them up the coast and put them into his hands in his own kitchen. And Roy tried them, and he stood, and he walked from the sink to the table and back, without the pain that had been his constant companion for longer than Emily had been alive. And then the old Marine sat down heavily at his own table and put his face in his hands and wept. And Emily sat down across from him and wept too, and neither of them said a word for a long time, and neither of them was the least bit ashamed. That she understood, sitting there, that single old man walking across his kitchen, that was worth more than every headline the whole story had ever generated. That was the entire point of everything distilled down into one man and 8 steps he hadn't been able to take that morning. And the mission grew in a way that had nothing to do with the viral video anymore, and everything to do with the plain fact that the thing worked and the cause was true. The veterans organization she'd spoken to became a partnership, and the partnership became a program. Emily's company would provide equipment at cost to any veteran who couldn't afford it, and the organization would cover the rest, and no one who had served would ever again be handed junk and told to be grateful. Not on Emily's watch. And the network Jack had promised her in that diner, the thing she hadn't believed was real, that there's a whole lot more of us than there are of him, it turned out to be enormous, and it turned out to be starving to help. Bikers moved her shipments across state lines for free. Retired machinists showed up to volunteer in her shop, men with 40 years in their hands and nowhere left to put it. Veterans who'd spent their whole lives being handed garbage came to help build something good because, for the first time in their lives, somebody was letting them be part of the fix instead of just the problem to be managed. It spread. Within a year, her crutches were under the arms of veterans in a dozen states. Within 2, it was thousands of people, and then tens of thousands. Emily never got rich, and she never wanted to, and the two things were connected. She got something she valued more, and she felt it every single morning. She walked into her shop and saw Danny's notebooks lying open on the bench, where she'd left them, waiting for her, the way a father's tools wait for a child who finally learned to use them. But the moment that mattered more than all of it, more than the company, more than the name coming off the building, more than the recording that ended, a powerful man came on a gray afternoon about 18 months after the rain. Jack called her, and she knew before he said a word that something was wrong, because his voice had gone thin and careful, and Jack Sullivan's voice was never thin. Emily, I need to tell you something, and I need you not to make a big thing out of it, because you know how I feel about a big thing. A pause. I've been sick for a good while now, since before I ever met you, matter of fact. And it's the kind that doesn't turn around, sweetheart. The doctors have been real clear with me about that. I've made my peace with it. I need you to try and make yours. Emily's whole body went to ice. Jack, don't do that yet. Let me talk first, because there's something I've never told you, and I want you to have it while I can still say it right. His voice was gentle and unhurried, and she understood with a lurch that he had been carrying this the entire time she'd known him, through the rain, through the quad, through every phone call, through Danny's notebooks, in Roy's kitchen, and all of it. He'd been dying the whole time, and he'd never once made it about himself. You remember I told you why I stopped that night? About Danny, about the ride I was supposed to give him and didn't, about the 30 years I carried it. I remember. Well, here's the part I left out. The reason I was even on that road that night in that rain at that hour. A breath. When a man finds out his time's short, Emily, he starts going back over his whole life, looking at all of it. And every time I looked at mine, all I could see was Danny in that chair, and the one thing I never fixed, the one thing I was going to, still carrying unfinished, same as I'd carried it every day for 30 years. His voice cracked clean down the middle. I'd made my peace with dying, sweetheart. What I couldn't make my peace with was dying with that, and I'd about given up. I figured some things just don't get made right, and you carry them to the grave, and that's the deal. A long, shaking breath. And then I'm riding home in the rain, near the end of everything, and there's a girl on the ground. And something in me, God or Danny, or I don't know, what something says show up. And I almost didn't. I told you that I almost rode on by, but I didn't. I stopped. And that girl turns out to be building the exact thing my brother spent 30 years of his life dreaming about and died without ever seeing built. Emily was crying now silently, the phone shaking against her ear. Do you understand what you did for me? Jack said, and his voice was full and raw and utterly without fear. A dying man got to finish the one thing he'd made his peace with dying without. Because a girl he pulled up out of a gutter turned out to be the answer to a prayer his brother said 30 years ago. I didn't save you that night, Emily. I've let you believe that this whole time, and it's not true, and I need you to know it before I go. You saved me. You let me be the man I should have been for Danny. You let me show up and have it count and have it be for him all at the same time. Most men don't get to see their own reason before the end. I did. You handed me my whole reason wrapped up in a broken crutch in the rain. His voice broke apart completely. So don't you dare cry for me. Don't you dare. I am the single luckiest old man who ever drew breath. I got to show up, and it counted. It counted for everything and everyone and forever. You gave me that. Now let me go easy knowing it landed. Emily couldn't speak. She sat on the floor of her shop, Danny's notebooks above her, on the bench, and she cried the way you cry maybe 3 or 4 times in a life. And on the other end of the line, an old man cried with her 300 miles of nothing between them, both of them holding the same 2 dead brothers in the same broken hearts. How long? She finally managed. Doesn't matter how long, Jack said softly. What matters is what I got to see. I got to watch Danny's chairs get built with my own eyes. I got to watch a rich man's name come off a building. I got to watch a scared girl in a gutter turn into the steadiest, hardest to move woman I ever knew in my whole life. I got to meet you. Most men go out with their questions still open. Every one of mine got answered. So you cried today, that's fine, you cried today. But tomorrow I need you to remember I'm the lucky one. Promise me you'll remember that. I promise, Emily whispered. I promise, Jack. She didn't leave him to face it from 300 miles away. She moved her whole operation north to be near him for the time he had left, packed up the shop, the notebooks, everything, and set up close enough to sit by him most days. And she did sit by him through most of those last months, the 2 of them talking or not talking, and slowly the shelf by his bed filled up her father's photograph, and Danny's, and now the 3 of them together. 3 men she had loved who had turned out in the end to be the same man, a man the world had tried again and again to hand junk and tell to be grateful, and who had refused every time in his own quiet way to be made small. At the very end, he wasn't afraid. She'd wondered if he would be, and he wasn't, not at all. He held her hand, his grip still surprisingly strong, and he looked at her with those pale gray eyes that had looked at her like a person on the worst night of her life, when 15 other people wouldn't, and he said, "You know what to do now." "I know what to do," she whispered. "Say it, so I hear it in your voice." "Show up," Emily said, and her voice didn't shake because she wouldn't let it, not for this, not for him. For the next one, whoever they are, however cold the world looks that day, however alone they think they are, I show up. And I don't fold, and I can't be bought, and I don't walk away. Ever. Jack Sullivan smiled, the full smile, the real one, the one she'd earned over 18 months and would carry for the rest of her life. And he closed his eyes, and a little while later, he was gone, easy at home with his brothers filling the house around him. And Emily held his hand a good while longer in the quiet, not ready to let it go. And outside in the lot, 70 motorcycles sat silent in the gray light, and 70 weathered men stood beside them in the cold, waiting to ride their brother home. They gave him a rider's funeral. The procession ran for miles down the coast highway, thunder rolling off the water, and Emily rode at the front in a car directly behind the hearse, because grief had taken the strength out of her legs, and she couldn't have held a bike upright that day. She kept Danny's notebooks in her lap the entire way, both hands flat on top of them, and she watched the endless column of headlights in the mirror and understood that she was watching the other kind of power, the kind that never took Richard Callahan's calls, the kind that couldn't be bought or closed or frightened, the kind Jack had promised her was real and vast on a night she'd been too broken to believe him. And when they laid him down in the plot right beside Danny's, the 2 Sullivan brothers together again at last, after everything, Emily stood at the graveside and did the only thing she could think of that was big enough to mean it. She'd had 2 pairs of crutches made in secret, the finest she had ever built or ever would, carbon fiber, and Danny's grip in her frame, the culmination of 2 lifetimes of dreaming pressed into 2 perfect objects. And she laid 1 pair across Jack's fresh grave and 1 pair across Danny's older one, and she straightened up and she said it loud enough that all 70 men behind her could hear every word. "You dreamed it," she said to Danny's stone, "for 30 years in the dark when everyone told you it couldn't be done. And she turned to Jack's and her voice held, "You showed up. When the world looked away, you showed up, and you spent the last good months of your life teaching me how. And I finished it. Do you hear me, both of you? I finished it, and I'm going to keep finishing it every day for the rest of my life. That's a promise, and you both know I don't fold and I don't break and I do not walk away. The company is still running today. It's larger now than Emily ever let herself imagine on the floor of that machine shop, and it still keeps its prices low on purpose, and it still gives equipment at cost to any veteran who cannot pay. And every single device that comes off the line still carries Danny Sullivan's 30-year-old grip design built into its bones and printed on every box in plain letters where anyone can read it. Original concept by Daniel Sullivan, who dreamed it first. Emily fought her own board to keep that line on the packaging, and she won the way she wins most things, by simply refusing to move. A man who spent his entire life being told he did not count, who filled notebook after notebook in the dark, certain that someone smarter with schooling he never got would build it someday. That man now has his name on 100,000 devices that hand people back their independence. That is what Emily Carter did with the thing Jack Sullivan pressed into her hands in the rain. She took two forgotten men and she made them unforgettable. And she made the whole world that had walked past them stop and read their names. And she never once stopped showing up. There was a young man 2 years on, being ground down and harassed at a job by people who assumed he had no one. Emily showed up, and she brought lawyers, and she brought bikers, and she brought the whole terrible, immovable weight of a woman who could no longer be intimidated by anyone alive. There was a girl in a wheelchair being told by a school that they simply couldn't accommodate her, sorry nothing to be done, and Emily showed up. Over and over, year after year, whenever the world went cold somewhere and turned its back on somebody lying on the ground, a woman on carbon fiber crutches showed up, and more often than not behind her came the low-rolling thunder of men who had learned a long time ago from a brother named Ghost that showing up is the only thing that was ever going to matter. She thinks about that night in the rain constantly, the gutter and the cold, and the two clean broken halves of her crutches floating toward the storm drain. The 15 people who looked and looked away. The boy at the fountain who watched her decide she wasn't worth the risk. The $100 bill dissolving in the puddle in front of her face. And most of all, she thinks about how close she came, how close every single person on the ground always comes to simply believing the world's verdict that she was not worth stopping for. That the crowd was right. That her father's dream and her own were small things, gutter things, plastic sticks in a drain things. And then she remembers the sound of one motorcycle low and steady and impossible cutting straight through the storm. Because this is the truth Jack Sullivan pulled up off the wet pavement, along with a frightened girl, the truth he spent the last good months of a dying life teaching her to carry the truth. She has spent every day since that funeral passing into other hands. The powerful are never once as strong as they look. Their strength is only the fact that no one has ever refused them. And the forgotten are never as alone as the silence makes them feel. And the whole crushing cruelty of a crowd that walks away 15 people, or 1,000 or a nation of them, can be undone completely permanently in a single instant by one solitary person who simply will not. Real strength was never power. It was never money or a name carved into the front of a building, or the size of a man who could snap a disabled girl's crutches in the rain and laugh while he did it. All of that turned out to be paper. Real strength is showing up when the world looks away. Danny Sullivan dreamed it. Jack Sullivan showed up and made it flesh. Emily Carter learned how and swore an oath over 2 graves and has never once broken it. And somewhere out there tonight, in some cold and rain, in some parking lot or hallway or gutter, there is a person on the ground right now, certain past all hope that no one is coming for them, and they are wrong. They are wrong because the lesson was passed on, and it is still being passed on this very night. And there is no power on this earth, none that can stop it now. That is the whole story. That is the only thing that ever mattered. And every word of it is true.